You ever get the feeling that someone is watching you? I'm not talking about the paranoid tinfoil hat kind of feeling. I mean the professional kind. The kind I've spent 20 years training federal agents to recognize, analyze, and neutralize. So, when I moved into what I thought was a sleepy, idyllic suburban enclave, I knew within 48 hours that I had acquired a dedicated and deeply unstable surveillance asset. She just happened to be the president of our homeowners association. I probably hold the unofficial world record for having 911 called on me for the quietest, most peaceful activity imaginable. An HOA Karen decided my silent martial arts practice was a clear and present danger to the cul-de-sac. What she couldn't possibly have known was that I didn't just understand the law, I taught the people who enforce it. She thought she was calling the cops on a weirdo neighbor. She had no idea she was actually dialing the number for her own meticulously orchestrated ruin. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight, because you're not going to believe how this suburban skirmish escalated into a full-blown federal investigation. My name is Alex. My job title is intentionally vague on paper, but the simplest way to explain it is that I'm a consultant. My clients are selective. Mostly, I work with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit out of Quantico. I'm not an agent. I'm a specialist. I build psychological profiles. I teach advanced threat assessment. And, most relevant to this story, I develop and instruct in defensive tactics and de-escalation techniques. It's a job that lives in the gray spaces of human behavior, and it requires an immense amount of mental and emotional energy. When I'm off the clock, I need absolute peace. My home is my sanctuary, the place I decompress from a world of calculated violence and predatory minds. That's why my wife, Sarah, and I chose this particular house. It was at the end of a quiet street, backing onto a small greenbelt. The key feature for me was the backyard. It was enclosed by a 6-foot cedar privacy fence, perfectly to code, and had a small, secluded flagstone patio surrounded by mature rhododendrons. It was my own private world. This is where I practiced. My martial arts wasn't the high-kicking, board-breaking stuff you see in movies. It was a slow, deliberate, and silent fusion of Tai Chi, for balance and mental focus, and Systema, a Russian art that emphasizes breathing, relaxation, and fluid movement. It looks a lot like a tranquil, moving meditation. It's the physical antidote to the psychological poison of my work. It calms my mind, centers my spirit, and keeps my body ready for the unfortunate reality that my de-escalation techniques might one day fail. It is, for me, as essential as breathing. We hadn't even finished unpacking when we met Brenda. She didn't so much knock on the door as announce her presence with a series of sharp, imperious raps. I opened it to find a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a blindingly white Lululemon tracksuit that looked more expensive than my car. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a rigid, aerodynamic helmet, and her face was a mask of pleasant condescension. Behind her, parked at a slightly aggressive angle on the street, was a gleaming white Cadillac Escalade, the kind of vehicle that serves as a status symbol and a battering ram in equal measure. "Hello," she said, her voice a little too loud. "I'm Brenda, your HOA president. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and drop off your copy of the covenants." She handed me a binder thick enough to stop a small caliber round. It felt less like a welcome and more like being served a subpoena. "We like to keep things pristine here at the Willows. I'm sure you'll fit right in." Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the visible parts of my house, her gaze lingering on the still-packed boxes. It wasn't a friendly glance. It was an inspection. "Your job is something in government consulting, I understand," she pried. Sarah had mentioned it briefly to the real estate agent. I gave her my standard, practiced non-answer. Something like that. Mostly boring paperwork. I recognized the behavior instantly. This was an information gatherer, a domain controller. She was assessing me, my status, my potential for compliance. I was, in her eyes, a new variable in her meticulously controlled equation. I gave her nothing. I was polite. I was bland. I was a gray rock. This, I would learn, was the most infuriating thing I could possibly be. The first volley in her campaign came a week later. It was a Saturday morning. I was on my patio, moving through a particularly slow Tai Chi form. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Later that day, an email arrived. The subject line read, "A gentle reminder. Neighborhood tranquility." The email was from Brenda, sent from her official HOA president address. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. "Dear new resident," it began, "it has come to my attention that some unusual activities are taking place in your backyard. While we encourage all residents to enjoy their property, we must be mindful of maintaining the peaceful and family-friendly aesthetic of the Willows. Displays of what appear to be aggressive or violent-looking exercises can be unsettling for neighbors who may have a view into your yard. Please be considerate." Unsettling? I was moving at the speed of a melting glacier. Aggressive? A sloth on tranquilizers had more aggression. I walked out to my patio and looked up. From one specific angle, if you were standing on a chair in the second-story master bathroom of the house behind mine, Brenda's house, you could just peer over the fence and see a corner of my patio. She had been watching me. The violation wasn't that I was being loud or disruptive. The violation was that I was doing something she didn't understand and therefore couldn't control. Sarah, a corporate lawyer who could dissect a contract with surgical precision, read the email and scoffed. "She's got nothing. Check the covenants." I already had. I'd read the entire binder cover to cover the day we got it. There were pages of regulations about lawn height, mailbox colors, and trash can visibility, but not a single word about silent, meditative exercise in your own fenced-in backyard. I drafted a polite, firm reply. "Dear Brenda," I wrote, "thank you for your email. I have reviewed the covenants and can find no rule pertaining to my actions. The activity you observed is a quiet form of exercise, much like yoga or stretching, and is performed in the privacy of my own yard. I can assure you, there is no disturbance being created. Regards, Alex." I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. People like Brenda don't operate on logic or rules. They operate on ego and power. My polite refusal to bend was not a resolution. It was a declaration of war. 2 days later, a stiff, official-looking envelope was in our mailbox. It was a formal violation notice from the HOA, complete with a $100 fine. The violation cited was creation of a public nuisance, disturbing neighborhood peace and aesthetic. Attached was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of me on my patio, clearly taken from her window. That's when I opened a new folder on my secure cloud drive. I labeled it Project Nightingale. I scanned the letter, the photo, and saved copies of the email exchange. I then took out my own camera, went into my backyard, and took a series of high-resolution photos, documenting her direct line of sight into my private space. I added a detailed narrative of our interactions, noting her behavioral markers, obsessive monitoring, misrepresentation of facts, and abuse of a position of authority. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a case file, and I was very, very good at building a case. As a final touch, I ordered 4 new high-definition security cameras. I wasn't just going to document her harassment, I was going to capture it in crystal-clear 4K resolution. The first HOA meeting felt less like a community gathering and more like a court proceeding in a banana republic, with Brenda presiding from a folding table at the front of the community clubhouse like a tin pot dictator. Sarah and I attended, armed with a folder containing the covenants and our correspondence. I wanted to address the ridiculous violation notice in person. The other board members, 3 men and 1 woman, sat beside Brenda with the weary, defeated expressions of people who had long ago surrendered their will. They were classic enablers, content to let Brenda wield the power as long as it wasn't directed at them. Brenda opened the meeting by addressing new business and immediately launched into my case. She didn't let me speak. Instead, she presented a comically distorted version of events. "As you know, we have new residents at number 14, she began, not even using my name. "Unfortunately, we've had some initial compliance issues." She held up the grainy photo she'd taken. I, and other concerned residents, a lie, I would later confirm, have observed what can only be described as aggressive martial arts training. We're talking combat drills. In a neighborhood full of children, this kind of behavior is simply not acceptable. We don't know who these people are, or what kind of business they might be in. She let the insinuation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. When she finally magnanimously allowed me to speak, I stood up, folder in hand. I remained calm, my voice steady. This was a familiar environment for me, dealing with irrational actors. "Good evening," I said, addressing the entire room, not just Brenda. "My name is Alex. I'd like to provide some context. The combat drills Brenda is referring to are a silent, meditative practice similar to Tai Chi. There is no noise, no aggression, and it takes place entirely within my fenced backyard." I held up a copy of the covenants. "I have read this document thoroughly. There is no provision that prohibits quiet recreation. The violation notice cites a public nuisance, but this activity is private and creates no disturbance." I then held up the photo she had sent. Furthermore, this photo was taken from an upstairs window of Brenda's home, looking down into my yard. That feels like a significant invasion of my privacy. Brenda's face tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged with facts. "We are not discussing my photography skills," she snapped. "We are discussing your behavior." She cut me off, turned to her board, and called for a vote on upholding the fine. As expected, 4 hands went up in unison with hers. It was a sham. The message was clear. The rules were whatever Brenda said they were. We paid the fine, not because we were admitting guilt, but because, as Sarah the lawyer advised, it was a necessary step in the paper trail. Paying under protest establishes a record of our attempt to comply with a corrupt system. The floodgates of petty tyranny were now open. Brenda had been emboldened. A week later, we got a notice for the grass along our driveway being 1/4 of an inch taller than the grass in the main lawn. A $50 fine. Then a warning about the unapproved reddish hue of the wood stain on my small practice deck. The deck was original to the house, and the stain had been there for 5 years. But according to Brenda, it was now an aesthetic emergency. Her campaign escalated from bureaucratic harassment to active psychological warfare. She took to walking her little white, poodly creature that was 90% fluff and 10% rage along my property line every single morning, precisely when I was trying to practice. She would stand there, phone to her ear in a fake conversation, while the dog yapped its head off, a tiny, furry agent of chaos. Her white Escalade became a permanent fixture, parked across the street or idling at the end of the cul-de-sac whenever I left or returned. It was a constant, looming presence, a reminder that I was being watched. I knew I needed more than just my own documentation. I needed ground-level intelligence. I saw my neighbor, Mark, out gardening one afternoon. Mark was a retired detective from a major metropolitan police force, a fact I'd learned from a casual chat when we first moved in. He was a quiet, sturdy man in his 60s with kind eyes that had seen too much. I wandered over. "Mark," I said, "got a minute? I need to ask you about our HOA president." Mark leaned on his shovel and let out a long, weary sigh, as if I'd just asked him to solve a cold case he'd been trying to forget. "Ah," he grunted. "You've been formally welcomed by Queen Brenda." He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "Let me guess. Fines? Vague warnings? Staring?" "All of the above," I said. "She seems particularly offended by my doing Tai Chi in my own backyard." Mark chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Son, she'd be offended if you were sitting in your own living room with the lights on. It's not about what you're doing. It's about the fact that you're doing it without her express written permission. She's been running this neighborhood like her own private police state for the 10 years she's been president." He went on to tell me stories. The family who was fined into submission until they removed their son's basketball hoop. The widow who was forced to repaint her front door 3 times because Brenda couldn't decide on an acceptable shade of colonial blue. Then Mark lowered his voice. "It's not just the power trip, Alex. There's something else. Her husband Bill is in commercial real estate. Big shot developer. For years, there have been rumors. Brenda pushes through these huge community beautification projects. A new front gate, extensive landscaping along the main road, things that cost a fortune. But the contracts always go to these obscure companies. The word is, she's using HOA funds to basically improve her own property value, and maybe skim a little off the top. My professional instincts flared. This was the piece I was missing. The harassment was the symptom. The potential motive was financial. Stalking, harassment, abuse of power, and now, possibly, fraud. Brenda wasn't just a petty tyrant. She might be a common criminal hiding behind a clipboard and a rulebook. Has anyone ever looked into it? I asked. Mark shook his head. A few have tried. She buries them in legal threats. The HOA has a law firm on retainer paid for with our dues, of course. Most people just give up. It's not worth the fight. He looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But you don't seem like the giving up type. I'm not, I said. I thanked Mark for the information and asked him to let me know if he heard anything else. As I walked back to my house, Project Nightingale took on a new dimension. It was no longer just about defending my right to peace and quiet. It was about dismantling a corrupt system from the inside out. Brenda had mistaken my calm demeanor for weakness. She had no idea she was methodically provoking a man who specialized in analyzing and exploiting the weaknesses of people exactly like her. The game had changed, and I was about to start playing for keeps. The constant, low-level harassment was designed to wear me down, a war of attrition fought with violation notices and a yapping poodle. But for me, it was simply data collection. Every petty fine, every lingering stare from the white Escalade was another entry in my file. Brenda thought she was tightening the screws. In reality, she was building the case against herself. I decided it was time to set a trap, a clean, legal, and undeniable event that would force her to escalate in a way she couldn't walk back. I needed her to cross a line, not just a perceived one, but a criminal one. My first step was proactive. I called the local police department's non-emergency number. I got a patient, professional dispatcher on the line. I explained the situation calmly and factually. My name is Alex. I started. I live at 14 Willow Creek Lane. I'm calling to create a record of ongoing harassment from my HOA president, Brenda last name. She has been fining me baselessly, monitoring my home, and I have reason to believe she may escalate her behavior. I practice a silent form of martial arts in my fenced backyard for exercise, and she has become fixated on it. I just want it noted that I am not causing any disturbance, and any call you may receive from her regarding my activities is likely to be a gross misrepresentation of the facts. The dispatcher took down the information, gave me an incident number, and assured me it was in their system. The first piece of my trap was now set. I had established a baseline of reasonableness with law enforcement before she had a chance to paint me as a menace. The next Saturday was a perfect, crisp autumn morning. I knew Brenda was home. The white Escalade was parked in its driveway like a sleeping predator. I disabled the audio alerts on my phone and made sure my 4 security cameras were all recording in high definition, their lenses covering every angle of my yard, my front door, and the street in front of my house. Then I went out to my patio and began my routine. I moved through my forms with deliberate slowness, my mind a sea of calm. I was a picture of tranquility. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the slight twitch of the curtain in her second-story window. She was watching. Perfect. I continued my practice, breathing deeply, completely silent. A one-man show for an audience of one. 20 minutes later, it happened. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of the house across the street. 2 patrol cars pulled up, parking in front of my house. This was it, the escalation I had anticipated. On my security feed, which I could view on a monitor inside, I saw 2 officers get out of their cars. They were young but professional, their body language cautious. They had their hands resting on their service weapons. They had clearly been told to expect a threat. I didn't wait for them to knock. I met them at my front door, opening it before they reached the porch. I stepped out with my hands empty and clearly visible. "Good morning, officers," I said calmly. "I assume you're here because of a call from my neighbor, Brenda." The lead officer, a tall man with a serious expression, seemed slightly taken aback by my calm demeanor. "Sir, we received a 911 call about a man in this area with weapons, possibly a sword, screaming and making threats." I maintained my neutral expression, though internally I was marveling at the sheer audacity of her lies. A sword? Screaming? It was pure fabrication, designed to elicit the strongest possible police response. This is how people get hurt. "Officers, I can assure you that's completely false," I said, my voice even. I was in my backyard performing a silent exercise routine, much like yoga. "I have no weapons, and I haven't made a sound. In fact, my entire property is under video surveillance. If you'd like, you can come in and see the footage from the last hour for yourselves." This was the checkmate move, an offer of complete transparency. The officers exchanged a look. "You have video?" the second one asked. His interest piqued. "I do," I replied. "Please come in." I led them through the house to my office, where I had a large monitor set up. I pulled up the footage from the camera pointed at my patio. There I was, in crystal clear HD, moving with a quiet grace that was the literal opposite of threatening. The audio track was pristine, capturing only the sound of a light breeze and a distant lawnmower. There was no screaming, no shouting. There were no weapons, no swords, nothing but me in workout clothes on a stone patio. I even rewound it and played the part where I noticed the curtain twitch in Brenda's window. The lead officer let out an audible sigh of frustration. He scrubbed his hand over his face. "So she lied," he said, more as a statement than a question. "On a 911 call." "I'm afraid so," I said. "This has been an ongoing issue. I actually called your non-emergency line a few days ago to put this situation on record." I handed him the incident number I had written down. He typed it into the laptop in his car. His eyes widened slightly as he read the report. Now he had the full picture: my proactive warning and her reactive, false report. "She's been harassing you," he stated. I simply nodded and pulled up the Project Nightingale folder on my desktop, showing them the log of fines, the emails, the photos she had taken. The two cops looked at each other, their entire demeanor shifting from tactical caution to weary annoyance. They weren't dealing with a potential threat. They were dealing with a classic case of a malicious crank call and neighborhood harassment. They had been used as pawns in her petty game. "We're going to go have a word with her," the lead officer said, his voice now tight with anger. "Sir, I am really sorry for the disturbance." "I understand completely, officer. You were responding to a serious call. Thank you for your professionalism." They left my house and walked directly across the street to Brenda's front door. My front-facing camera, equipped with a sensitive directional microphone, captured the entire exchange. Brenda answered the door with a look of feigned concern on her face. "Oh, officers, thank God you're here. Did you get him?" The lead officer did not look amused. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you about your 911 call. You reported a man with a sword, screaming and making threats." "Yes, that's what I saw," she insisted, her voice shrill. "Ma'am, we just spoke to your neighbor," the officer said, his tone like ice. "We've seen his video surveillance of the entire incident. He was alone, he was silent, and he had no weapons. You filed a false police report. Do you have any idea how serious that is? You tied up 2 units that could have been needed for a real emergency." Brenda's face went from concerned to indignant. "Are you calling me a liar? I know what I saw. He's a dangerous person." "What we know," the officer cut in, his voice sharp, "is that what you reported on a recorded 911 line is a provable falsehood. Misuse of emergency services is a crime. We're giving you a warning today. But if we ever get another call like this from you, you will be the one in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" Brenda was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She sputtered for a moment before slamming the door in their faces. The officers shook their heads and walked back to their cars. The trap had been sprung, and the result was better than I could have hoped for. I now had a formal police report documenting her crime. I had unimpeachable video evidence. I had the smoking gun. Brenda, in her arrogant attempt to use the system against me, had just handed me the very weapon I needed to bring her entire kingdom crashing down. The game of suburban chess was over. It was time to flip the board. The 911 call was the tipping point. Brenda had escalated from petty harassment, which is a civil matter, to filing a false police report, which is a criminal offense. She had weaponized the emergency response system. In my world, that's a significant behavioral marker. It demonstrates a dangerous level of entitlement and a disregard for consequences that often correlates with other antisocial behaviors. She thought she was untouchable. It was time to introduce her to the concept of consequences on a scale she couldn't possibly imagine. This is where the slightly hyperbolic phrase, "I own the FBI," becomes relevant. I don't, of course. But my position as a high-level consultant and instructor for the Bureau gives me something far more valuable than ownership. It gives me credibility and access. I know the language, the procedures, and the mindset. I know what constitutes a federal crime and how to package a referral so that it's taken seriously. A civilian complaint about an HOA president might get lost in a pile. A meticulously documented case file, submitted by one of their own trusted analysts and detailing potential federal crimes, gets immediate attention. I spent the entire weekend transforming Project Nightingale from a personal log into a professional intelligence product. I didn't write it as a victim. I wrote it as a behavioral analyst. The document I created was 22 pages long, single-spaced, with a table of contents and appendices. I titled it, Subject Analysis. Brenda, last name. A case study in escalating harassment, misuse of public services, and potential financial crimes. The first section detailed the psychological campaign. I laid out the timeline of events, from the first email to the 911 call. I used professional terminology, describing her actions as a pattern of narcissistic-driven dominance behavior, targeted stalking, and the use of administrative authority to inflict psychological distress. I included printouts of the fines, the emails, and high-resolution stills from my security footage, including the image of her peering from her window. The second section focused on the criminal act. I embedded the police report number from the false 911 call. I included a transcript of the audio my camera had captured of her conversation with the officers. I analyzed her lies on the 911 call, the sword, the screaming not as simple exaggerations, but as deliberate fabrications intended to provoke a lethal force response against the target, which is how a threat analyst would frame it. The third and most critical section was about the money. Using the tip from my neighbor Mark, I had spent a few hours doing some deep dive open source intelligence gathering, all perfectly legal. I pulled the HOA's tax filings, which are public record. I cross-referenced them with county business and property records. It didn't take long to find the pattern Mark had hinted at. Over the past 5 years, the HOA had paid over 300 to 3 different landscaping and maintenance companies for community enhancement projects. These companies all had one thing in common. Their registered business addresses were P.O. boxes, and the incorporation papers were filed by a registered agent notorious for creating anonymous shell LLCs. A little more digging revealed that one of those P.O. boxes was also linked to a defunct side business owned by Brenda's husband, Bill. It was circumstantial, but it was a thick, pungent cloud of smoke. In this section, I laid out the potential for federal crimes. I posited that the HOA, an interstate entity, due to its use of the U.S. mail for billing and a national management company, was being used as a vehicle for wire fraud, interstate electronic bank transfers, and mail fraud, sending fraudulent bills and notices. I suggested a potential conspiracy and money laundering scheme, where HOA dues were being funneled through these shell companies and kicked back to Brenda and her husband. I stated, the subject's overt harassment campaign may be a preemptive defense mechanism designed to intimidate or discredit any resident who might start scrutinizing the HOA's financial records. On Monday morning, I didn't pick up the phone and call in a favor. That's not how it works. I sent a secure, encrypted email to David Evans, a deputy assistant director at FBI headquarters and a man I'd worked with for over a decade. He was a friend, but more importantly, he was a consummate professional who trusted my judgment implicitly. The subject line was succinct: professional consultation, potential public corruption matter. In the body of the email, I was brief and to the point. David, I wrote, I am writing to you as a private citizen who has encountered a situation that now bears the hallmarks of federal criminal activity. I have compiled a preliminary analysis of a subject who, in her capacity as an HOA president, exhibits a pattern of escalating harassment and appears to be engaged in significant financial fraud. The file is attached for your review. The behavior profile is troubling, and the financial trail, while preliminary, is highly suggestive of mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. I believe this warrants a look from the Public Corruption Squad in the relevant field office. This is beyond a neighborhood dispute. This is a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. I hit send. 4 hours later, I received a one-line reply from Evans. Alex, I've read your report. Meticulous as always. I forwarded it to the special agent in charge in your district with a strong recommendation for preliminary review. Stay safe. The wheels of a machine far larger than Brenda could ever comprehend began to turn. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and methodical. A few weeks later, a very bland-looking junior agent from the FBI's local field office paid a visit to the National Property Management Company that held the HOA's accounts. He didn't come with questions. He came with a federal subpoena for every financial record, every contract, every invoice, and every email communication related to the Willows HOA for the past 7 years. Next, 2 agents, looking like board accountants, scheduled interviews with the other members of the HOA board. Faced with the quiet authority of federal investigators, their loyalty to Brenda evaporated. One by one, they admitted that Brenda handled everything related to finances. They never saw the bids from contractors. They never reviewed the invoices. They just signed whatever she put in front of them during the meetings. They threw her under the bus to save themselves, painting a perfect picture of a conspiracy with Brenda as the undisputed ringleader. The agents thanked them for their cooperation. The net was closing, and Brenda had absolutely no idea she was even being hunted. She was still busy leaving violation notices on people's doors, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break directly over her head. The downfall of Queen Brenda was not a dramatic confrontation in a rain-swept street. It was something far more surgical, far more public, and infinitely more humiliating. It took place at the annual HOA meeting, the very stage upon which she had built her reign. The irony was poetic. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls and uncomfortable folding chairs. The air was thick with the usual blend of resident apathy and resentment. Brenda, standing at a podium at the front, was in her element. She wore a power suit, the color of dried blood, and a smug expression that suggested she was about to bestow a great gift upon her loyal subjects. Her husband, Bill, sat in the front row, looking placid and wealthy, a man utterly detached from the petty squabbles of his wife's hobby, unaware that he was a primary subject in an active federal investigation. I was there, of course. I had chosen a seat in the very back corner of the room, next to Mark, the retired cop. I was just another face in the crowd, a ghost in the machine. Good evening, everyone, Brenda began, her voice echoing slightly through the cheap microphone. As you know, our community requires constant upkeep to maintain its prestige. She launched into a speech about rising costs and the need for vigilance. Then came the bombshell she intended to drop. Therefore, the board has approved a one-time special assessment of $2,000 per household, effective next month, to fund a series of urgent capital improvements, including a complete redesign of the front entrance. A wave of groans and angry murmurs rippled through the room. $2,000. People were starting to protest, to stand up and shout questions. Brenda held up a hand for silence, a look of annoyance on her face. This was the moment she craved the dissent she could crush with the gavel of her authority. But before she could speak again, the back doors of the clubhouse opened silently. 2 men entered. They did not look like residents. They wore simple, dark, conservative suits. They had the quiet, observant confidence of men who are never out of place. They were FBI agents. They didn't rush. They walked calmly and deliberately up the center aisle, the crowd parting for them like the Red Sea. They walked directly to the podium. One of the agents, a man with graying temples and piercing blue eyes, leaned toward the microphone, his movement displacing Brenda from her position of power. The room fell into a dead, shocked silence. "Brenda? Last name?" the agent asked, his voice calm, clear, and amplified throughout the room. Brenda looked utterly bewildered. "Yes? I'm in the middle of a meeting." "Ma'am," the agent continued, holding up a folded document, "I'm Special Agent Connolly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest." If a sound could have a physical weight, the collective gasp in that room would have broken the foundation. Brenda's face, just moments before flushed with power, went corpse white. Her smugness didn't just fade, it shattered, leaving behind a raw, naked panic. "For what?" she stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. Agent Connolly, for the benefit of the entire assembled neighborhood, listed the charges in a clear, methodical monotone. For conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. He then turned his head slightly and looked directly at her husband in the front row. "William, last name, we have a warrant for you as well. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Bill looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The second agent was already on him, expertly and discreetly cuffing him up at the podium. Agent Connolly took Brenda by the arm. She was too stunned to resist. As they turned to lead her away, her frantic eyes scanned the crowd of horrified faces. And then she saw me. Standing in the back corner, perfectly still, my expression completely neutral. Our eyes locked for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, the confusion in her eyes was replaced by a flash of dawning, horrifying comprehension. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. But she knew. She knew this was my doing. The sight of her, the queen of the cul-de-sac, being led past her own constituents in handcuffs, was the checkmate. They walked her right past her gleaming white Escalade in the parking lot and placed her in the back of a completely unremarkable, government-issue Ford sedan. The aftermath was swift and total. The HOA was immediately put into receivership by a court order. The forensic audit ordered by the FBI was a bloodbath. It revealed that Brenda and Bill had embezzled nearly $400,000 over 7 years. The urgent capital improvements she had just announced were a complete fabrication. The special assessment was going to be the down payment on a vacation home in Florida. They had bled their own neighbors dry to fund their lifestyle. A new HOA board was elected a few months later. My neighbor, Mark, the retired detective, was unanimously voted in as the new president. His first act was to hold a public shredding of half the pages in the covenant book, eliminating all the petty, restrictive rules Brenda had created. A sense of liberation swept through the neighborhood. The money was eventually recovered through the seizure and sale of the couple's assets, including the Escalade, the country club membership, and the very house from which Brenda had spied on me. They both pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence and are currently serving time in a minimum security federal prison. I never told anyone my role in it all. I didn't need to. I got what I wanted: peace and quiet. I can now practice my martial arts on my patio anytime I like, in absolute, undisturbed tranquility. It was never about revenge, not in the emotional, angry sense. For me, it was a problem-solving exercise. I was presented with an unstable and hostile actor. I analyzed their patterns, I identified their vulnerabilities, and I used the appropriate, legitimate system to neutralize the threat. Brenda thought she was fighting a strange neighbor over his weird hobby. She never understood that she was picking a fight with a man whose entire life's work was to professionally dismantle people just like her. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a fist or a sword, but a well-documented file. And you should never, ever, underestimate a person who is willing to go to extraordinary lengths just to be left alone. Let me know in the comments about your own HOA nightmare stories. Believe me, I'll be reading them.